All right, everybody, welcome to this week's episode of We As Start Talking. I'm Gareth, going to be hosting the show today. I'm pretty excited as I have got Dr. Jordan Shallow on the show today. Jordan, how you doing?
Yeah, good man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. So a little bit of a backstory. We're going to get into some awesome stuff today on the show. First of all, just to introduce Jordan, he's a doctor of chiropractor, originally from Windsor, Ontario, and is a strength and conditioning coach, competes in powerlifting, and is also the founder of Prescript, prescript.com. Go check that out. I'll put it in the show notes. So delivering education throughout the world of fitness with your background. And I guess prior to that, or the evolution of that, is going through chiropractic school, coming out of the back of that, working for Apple down in the States, and kind of getting that, I guess, that practical clinic-based environment of chiropractic, and then kind of moving that with your knowledge around, fitness and exercise and movement, biomechanics, and taking that into the world of fitness, which is where we kind of connected. And where I've kind of seen a lot of your work. So excited to dig a little bit into your story, talk a little bit about obviously Prescript and RX Radio, which is the awesome podcast that you host. Yeah, that's kind of where we're going to go today. And I wanted to start with, I guess, the transition. I want to dig into a little bit of you, basically, the kind of the man behind the education, the deadlifts, and all the other things that we kind of see, or what many people have seen kind of online or in courses in education. And talking a little bit about your journey. So obviously you're from Windsor, Ontario originally. You're now back in Toronto, and you've been on a bit of a journey, much like myself, through the world. So yeah, tell us a little bit, just a snapshot of kind of little Jordan. However, I feel like with your stature, maybe you were never that little, but maybe walk us through a little bit of that.
Yeah, so I started my undergrad actually. It's usually a half decent place to start. I started studying history and political science when I first got into undergrad at, like, I don't know, 18 or whatever. A couple of years into that, I was kind of got heavy into training. I was always into sport. I played hockey fairly competitively at a young age, and started to see as I advanced that, the strength conditioning side, whatever that looked like, in 2008. Um, so that really kind of sparked my interest and then got me into the gym, and purely as a vessel to get better at hockey. And hockey was kind of my main thing, and I was earmarked for doing a master's and PhD in history. And then I got a few years into it and just realized that whether it was on the ice or in class, I'd just rather be in the gym. So I got a job as a personal trainer and just spent more and more time in the gym. And then soon hockey just became an afterthought, and training became kind of the top of my mind. And same with school, really. I was like, okay, well, I can't skip school and just be in the gym all the time, but how can I find a track that'll allow me to be in the gym as school? And that kind of transitioned me from history into kinesiology, and then kinesiology then into chiropractic, and then moved out to California for chiropractic college. Uh, excuse me, graduated there, got a job soon after with Apple. So I kind of got thrown right into the fire as clinical experience. I was seeing, in a corporate setting like that, 250 patients a week in a very high volume setting. Got into competitive powerlifting through a friend of mine, Dan Green. He's quite the prominent lifter in the space, and transitioned my practice into his gym, and took on a job with Stanford University as the strength conditioning coach for the rugby teams, and started RX Radio and Prescript. As did that in California for maybe 2 or 3 years, maybe longer, maybe 3, 4 years. And then with Prescript, sort of ended up getting a lot of speaking arrangements kind of on the back end of some competitions I would do in powerlifting, and was able to kind of leverage that to just bring me on the road full time. So I packed up all my stuff about 2.5 years ago and hit the road and just did seminar after seminar after seminar, and just moved from city to city to city 1 week at a time for 2.5 years, pretty much up until honestly like 3 weeks ago is the first time I've gotten back. First time this is like a home. This is not an Airbnb. This is actually, so I traveled the entirety of the last 2.5 years. I did pretty much a seminar a weekend at least, and sometimes some stuff during the week, and developed some online curriculum for the public online. And that was sort of the mainstay of Prescript. And now I'm back in Toronto, and I pretty much run the day-to-day operations. I still teach a lot of the Prescript courses live online. And then I kind of have my side business passion. I work with a handful of some professional athletes in various sports, NHL, NFL, things like that, remote programming, and I do some chiropractic work privately as well. So yeah, that's it really. I mean, that's the end of the pod. That's everything you need to know about me in 2 minutes or less.
Sweet. Is that the couch behind you that you were talking about on the podcast about 3 weeks ago that you went in and bought in 2 seconds?
No, this is an eBay purchase or not
Oh,
an Amazon purchase. That's in the other room. But yes, if it's not going to matter in 5 years, I'm not going to spend 5 minutes on it. So especially when it comes to interior design, I don't really care. I'm a function first kind of person across the board.
can I sit on it? Perfect.
Done.
Love that approach. So obviously now the listeners, and I've heard and I know a lot of your backstory already, but a lot of the listeners have kind of heard that, and it would be probably thinking there's a whole load of fitness stuff in there that we're going to talk about. However, what I want to really dig into is that journey takes a lot of bravery. It takes a lot of kind of who you are as a person to take those big steps in life. And what I'm more intrigued about is to get there. Who's the person that gets there and makes those choices? And a big thing for me. So I always talk on the podcast about how I bring guests onto the show, and a lot of for me it's about energy. So and that's whether we interact via social media, whether we interact via person. I like to bring people on that have a certain energy. Now we've only met once in person, very briefly. However, a big thing for me was the openness, the honesty, and just that it was a very no walls approach. I've been around a lot of people in the industry that have presented at a lot of conferences, and there's a lot of walls up in the fitness industry. And maybe that's for whatever reason, we can probably get into that, but you didn't have that. And that was interesting to me because we kind of bumped into each other, asking on an escalator in a club, and in one of our fitness clubs here, and it was just that honest, no walls, just like you have a conversation with any kind of buddy over coffee. And that intrigued me, and I wonder is that just something that comes naturally? Is it something you work on? And how do you show up every day like that, or do you show up like that every day?
Yeah, it's a good point, man. Like, 'cause I'm sure we met. We could probably have an off-air conversation with the people we've met, and that dynamic not have been as true as you may have thought it to be, and like a little bit strange. And for me, it's always been. I mean, a lot of it I think stems from social media, like because that is the preconceived notion that you're going to cast it into the world, and whether it's, I mean, it can be a little bit more of like a deliberate approach now, but I never wanted to create a dissonance between my digital avatar and myself. So like I don't, and you post old photos of you training and you're just trying to talk about some point, but just never, when I do story stuff or podcast stuff, like I know people who play a caricature of themselves on the internet, and that division, that dissonance has not found them well down the road. So I was like, all right, if you're gonna like me, you're gonna like me, or you're gonna get to know me. And if you like the character on the internet and it's different, then it's not gonna work anyways. So for me, I honestly think one of the biggest drivers of that is I've met people who are like, wow, you're exactly what I thought you'd be, and that's great. Or in the vice versa, I have a lot of respect for people that I don't like on the internet, and I meet them in person and I still don't like them, which is like, great, that's awesome, good for you. Like you're exactly the person I don't like on the internet in person, and I kind of respect that. But at the very least, like I just concerned, like I was always concerned in seeing how that divide between the social avatar and the actual personality, what that did to people and the anxiety of that dissonance. I just couldn't partake in it. If I was going to do it, I was just going to be. I only kind of have one gear. I'm not a great actor by any stretch of the imagination, so. Yeah, I think it was just kind of born out of like somewhat of a necessity of kind of seeing or interpreting how that dissonance and divide, like how that goes wrong and where that path leads. Because it's like I like doing this, man. Like this is crazy for me that I can call part of this work. And I think the sustainability aspect of it is what's really appealing to that approach. It's like I could do this forever because this is just kind of this is the straight dope. This is what you get. This is what my mom gets. This is what my grandma gets. It's just kind of one gear, and that's it.
Yeah, for sure. We talk a lot about being the best version of yourself. So a big part of where our podcast is rooted, and our whole kind of community is rooted, is being the best version. And I often think that it's being the best version of you, but it has to be authentic, right? Because sometimes you show up a little differently, and people often do, right? People don't know how to maybe detach their CEO lifestyle at work and then go home and be able to still show up as, you know, the best version of themselves. However, it's a very different environment in where we lead. And I think that's such an important point. And I've definitely had that experience where you kind of follow someone, you get really into somebody's like content and they know what they stand for and their morals. And then, like you said, you meet them and you're like, who the fuck's this guy? It's completely different, right? And then you lose this, there's this weird, and it's kind of, it almost, for some reason, it should be making them feel awkward, but it makes me feel awkward. Super weird. So I really appreciate that about you and about many people that I meet. And it's something that I'm very cognizant of being online and having, you know, having a platform online, especially on a podcast, is that hopefully I get to meet some people that are on the podcast and people that listen to the podcast. And I want to be able to get that. So that's just something that ticks over in my brain a lot. And it's super interesting the way that the world works and how the mask of social media, it's kind of, the internet's a scary place.
Yeah, I mean, this could all be a simulation, but the second I pick up my cell phone and I go on Instagram, I know that that's a simulation. So it's like,
Yeah,
all right, I want to control as many variables there as I can.
for sure. So from leading on from that, I have another key kind of thing that really stands out, something that I picked up off a podcast of yours a few years back, and it stood out massively, and people would have seen this quote out a lot, and I don't know if it's actually your quote, but we're just going to say it is because there's no one else here and we can do what we want.
Internet.
Right? The way you do one thing is the way you do everything. You're a big believer of that because I hear it all the time.
Yeah, actually, I had a guy message me the other day with a fresh tattoo of that on his chest,
Oh, wow.
which was I always say, fuck, man, own it. I love it. Yeah, I think to I like to think I'm like hyper rational and hyper logical, which in some facets of my life is counterintuitive, but to me that creates an urgency or an onus or like a responsibility to approach everything in a certain way. So if someone comes to me and, you know, in business or in training or whatever, like, you know, I can tell. It's weird. Have you ever seen it's one of the Batman movies? It's the Joker one, the Heath Ledger one,
Yeah.
where he's in the room and they finally captured him, but he has this whole scheme afoot and he's in with the other detective and he's like, you know, they figure out who people are when they die, and I've killed 4 of your friends or whatever. So do you want to know which one of your friends are cowards? And it's like, you know, I don't think we need the imminent mortality to figure out who people are. I think people will show you their true colors. So it's for me of like, look, whether I'm, you know, I run into someone on an escalator, or whether I'm, you know, trying to write a book, or whether I'm doing a set of lateral raises in the gym, it's like there's a certain level of like presence as far as like being aware and being kind of like in the moment, in the present kind of thing. And there's a certain adherence to a standard of quality and consciousness that, whether it's a lateral raise, whether it's book writing, whether it's a passing conversation, to me, it just makes it easier for me to interpret the world when things are different, when people are different. And then it just allows me to, you know, kind of, I don't want to say dispel or dispense with people or things or ideas quickly, but it allows me to filter through a lot of incoming stuff very fast. It's like, okay, if this is how this presents in this arena, I'm not going to partake, or vice versa. Like, hey, you know, like, you know, there's that saying of, you know, people like, watch how people treat someone who can't do anything for them, like the old, like the waitress at the restaurant thing. I'm always trying to pay attention to that, and it just helps me sort of filter out what people's intentions are. So yeah, it's something that I try and adhere to. I act as though I try and adhere to that. That's probably a more direct way of saying it.
Yeah, how you treat everybody, right? There's no ulterior motive to that. And I talk about this. So I have a 3-year-old coming up 4-year-old, and we talk about this a lot. And she often asks me, "Daddy, why did you say hello? Why did you wave at that person? Why did you say good morning? Or why did you say good morning to this person?" And, you know, and it might be in a store where that person is doing something for me, but it might just be walking down the street. And my always response is, why not? Like, just show up, because if I'm going to do it in a store, I'm going to do it on a podcast, I'm going to do it walking down the street. Like, it makes no difference to me. So I want to show up across those different areas of life, which is so super important, and it obviously a great learning opportunity for everybody. But just being aware and teaching awareness to whoever it is, someone on a course, a client, your child, teaching that awareness of life and being hyper aware of what's going on and how you act in regards to that was so important, right? And it makes me think about. So we recorded an episode a few months back about personal ecosystems, and the reason why this quote was kind of a bit of a driver behind that. So you'll be pleased to know that. So I didn't give you any credit on the show, but maybe I will in the future. I just did now. So that quote kind of led into this personal ecosystem and how we have, imagine, that kind of ecosystem of your life and all those different facets that are interconnected. So it's you as a educator, it's you as a chiropractor, it's you as a powerlifter, as a partner, it might be somebody as a parent, someone in their community, is all these facets of your ecosystem of life, and you got to show up as the best version of yourself authentically in those areas. But if one side gets pulled down, it pulls the others down. So if I'm doing a great job at work and I'm doing a great job as a partner, but I'm sucking as a parent, eventually the way I show up as a parent, the way I do that thing is going to start to bring the other things down as well. And that's where it resonated with me a lot. And I don't know if that was the intention in the quote, but it was to really see everything and decide what bits of my life am I operating at like an 8 or a 7, and what bits am I operating at a 10, and how do I get those other things to a 10, or potentially remove those things. However, that would be hard if you were a parent and you sucked as a parent. You can't really get rid of your kids, so you need to kind of figure it out. But how does that kind of sit in the way that you operate your life?
Yeah. So, I mean, not to be too like metaphysical, but Malcolm Gladwell talks about strong link versus weak link games, right? So basketball is very much a strong link game where you can go out and essentially buy a championship, right? Lakers looks like they've earmarked for 2 more 85 million across 2 years with LeBron. It's very clearly a strong link game. Now, to contrast that with like a game like European football or soccer is very much a weak link game. Whereas if you have a poor defender, the other team can exploit that defender, and no matter how good your best player is, you will fall to the level of your weakest link. So with me, with like, the facets of my life, and I live like a very, I don't want to say like monk, but I have a pretty now, like, and even when I was on the road, one of the ways that made it so sustainable was that I'm very procedural and very systematic. I do the same thing every day. I do it in different cities. I work in different coffee shops. I train in different gyms. I stay in different Airbnbs or whatever, but everything is the same. And that structure, I think, allows for that high level of variability to not really just like, melt the system and blue wire cross the red wire and the whole thing explodes. So for me, it's just like that proceduralization is just something that allows me to operate at somewhat of like a higher, not always a higher frequency, but it allows it to be like a little bit more sustainable, right? So it's this idea that like, look, if I can standardize for all my variables, when things pop up, I can sort of grab them and see them a little bit easier. So it's yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not. I kind of went adrift on that, but
no, I think it does. I think I agree, like that procedural thing, and it's because I think where it links is if you have that area of life where it needs to be bumped up to a 10 to support everything else.
Right.
It's about that procedural effect to it, right? And
that allows me to find the weak links. I think that was probably the best way to sum it up. So like, and there are things like I know my weak links, like I very kind of set in my ways so that my weak, like I don't have weak links in the way I live, but that means entire compartments of my life I just get rid of, right? There are things in my life that I just like. I think compare it this way. You ever seen like, and I speak a lot in like analogies and stuff, so I do apologize, but like a space movie where they're on the ship, but the ship like some sort of the Hubble's whatever International Space Station, and then one of parts of the ship is on fire, and they just go close hatch D6 and let the motherfucker burn. That's kind of like how. So I pretty much the things I do now, I like to think I do as close to a 10 as possible. But like, you are the most responsible person I've ever met. Like you're talking about like kids and partners and all that. I just look at those hatches and go, close hatch D6. And I just sit back and go, everything's great in here. So basically it's like, I love my job. I love the work I do. I love being able to do this. I love my freedom. Um, I love training. I love talking about training. I love writing about training. And so that's the part of the ship I'm in. Everything else that could be a weak link, and I don't suggest you do this at home, I've just closed the hatches and just let it burn. So yeah, it definitely has its limitations. Like, again, kind of this monk lifestyle. But I think allowing the more for me that I can control for those variables, I could, if I was less in my own head, attempt to fix these other regions of the ship. And I suggest for other people that if those things are important to you, you do that. But I think having constants allows for the aberrations to come more apparent, right? So I think some people get to a point where in this balance of like, let's say the partner, if you have a kid, if you have extended family, if you have work, if you have a social circle, if you have training, so you have all these different, I don't want to say mass, but all these different responsibilities to people or tasks or whatever. Some people might not, if they're not aware, not in control of their environment, they might not realize, that there's a change that's been made towards the negative, or a trend towards the negative, until it's too late, because there's no control, right? With me, like, I can tell with work, with training, and the very few things that I concern myself with, if I go from a 9.8 to a 9.7, I know about it, right? Like, I consider, and this is kind of a nerdy comparison, but like, if you see osteoporosis on an x-ray, there's already been like 30 to 40% bone loss. So that's a terrible way to start to find out if you have osteoporosis or not, because we've already gone through so much change. So it's kind of like the way you look at like your behaviors across these different like indices is like, okay, the more control I can attempt to exact. And I know people are kind of like, oh, just like let life happen. It's like, sorry, that doesn't work for me. So, because I can pick up like very subtle changes rather than like, oh, I've lost 30% capacity in this particular facet of my life. I can tell you what I've lost 2%, right? So it allows me, albeit, most of my strategies around fixing things are just going, do I need it really? No. Okay, let it burn. And then it just doesn't affect the rest of the ship. But I think being able to have control and a schedule and discipline around those things allows me to kind of pick up for like subtle changes, in positive or negative.
Yeah, and I think the discipline around those. It's funny. I spoke about this yesterday as well on a show that I recorded, and it was the discussion of how sometimes people see that discipline and that structure, and let life be, and da 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 da. That's great, and do that, but typically the people I come into contact that do that are a shit show. So there needs to be some there, and my belief is that with discipline, number one, it's that thing you need to find after motivation. Number one. Because that's what's going to keep you on track with anything in life. And number two is it creates freedom. So people think discipline takes it away. And this is the thing I hear feedback on the shows and things that I talk about. I'm like, no, bullshit. Discipline creates the freedom, because when you're disciplined around the things that you enjoy to do and you get those things done and they give you confidence, they give you motivation, you want more from it, you then continue on that path. But you're creating freedom in your life from doing it. So the discipline creates that as an end result. And I think people miss the link there between those two things.
I think if they calibrated it different, it's funny. One of the first Poliquin articles I ever read was about like the balance of discipline and how discipline is kind of like a myth. And I don't know if it was Charles. It doesn't necessarily sound like a Charles sentiment, but it was on at the time the Poliquin site, and it was like discipline is a balance of things you love to do, right? Like if you love the idea, I have some friends prepping for the Mr. Olympia right now. If you love the idea of Mr. Olympia more than you love cake, then your behaviors will act as such, right? Me, not so much, right? So like I love cake more than I love the idea of a Sandow trophy. So that's why I'm not 6%, 4%, 3% body fat, right? So I think when met with that level of opposition and kind of this like, peace and love sort of millennial type of approach, and I'm accused of being a little bit more callous in what I do. I don't think people understand how much I actually love what I do. And like, I don't want to project anything, but I always just say, look, like I'm not disciplined. I just have found the thing I love to do. And perhaps for you to be as disciplined as you would have to be to mirror or emulate this, you just need to find the thing that you love. That seems to resonate more with like the naysayers of like, because I in popular culture, right, the Jocko Willinks of the world, like, yes sir, no sir, the most like intense. And the Jocko's book is, I think, has a lot of merit, and he's a very special person. But I think that can be off-putting to a softer generation. And so it's like, in speaking, because I definitely resonate with, Jocko, albeit not with the crazy experience and all that. But like, there is a certain point where you just have to get it done. And it's not about being happy, it's about being fulfilled. And for me, it's like, when I met with that level of criticism, it's like, look, like, it's not discipline, sure, it's just what you love to do. And that seems to kind of ease tensions, and sort of disarms people with that opposition.
Yeah, that's powerful. I love that. And just another really great insight on it, because and it is different for everybody. But I agree, and I think coming back to the ecosystem thing and the closing the hatch, it's linked to that. Like, if you're not disciplined and you're not sticking to the things in your life, then you need to start to detach yourself from some of those things if they're not important to you. Because clearly, if you're not doing it, like, I'm dedicated to being a better dad. We use that as for an example because I touched on it. Is I'm dedicated to that process, because I wouldn't be here if I'm too logical and in stuck in my processes to get to this point with a 4-year-old and not want to be here. And it's important to me, so I'm dedicated to that. There's other things in my life since that in the last 4 years where I'm like you said, close the hatch, let it burn, because that's not important to me. And if it isn't, then I've spent my life hanging on to those things and just saying, oh well, I'll do it at a 5 out of 10 and it will still be there. Like, there's no point, and you have to get rid of those things. And I think to that point as well, with closing the hatch on things, is sometimes 2 points. First point is, sometimes I think you need to close the hatch, and maybe it's not permanently. Maybe I'm just going to close the hatch and let it burn for a bit. I'll go figure it out later. And that might be a daily thing, a weekly thing. It might be for a couple of years, but it might just be, I might just get up one day and be like, fuck it, I need to go out for 2 hours on my own. Let everything else burn. I'll go do what I need to do. I'll come back and sort it out later. So I think it can be on a micro. It could be, good takeaway. It could be, you can do that in your life and that's okay. Or you just get rid of it completely. And the second point was, we're talking about things. However, this is a big talking point in a lot of our shows and a lot of our kind of community, the We As community, is that applies to people too.
Oh yeah.
and this is a big discussion, is do we just close the hatch on people and leave them out in space? My answer is yes to that. However, there's kickback on that. People are like, oh, well, you need to dig deeper and you need to find out and you need to... And I'm like, that just spends more of my energy. Sometimes you just need to leave them in space. So I feel like almost know what your answer is going to be, but I'd like to get your thoughts on it anyway.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe to start with the first one, like, I used to use air travel as that. Air travel was me closing the hatch. Like a good transatlantic, trans-Pacific. Give me 16 hours to just like, and literally, because the whole world could burn and I'd have no idea. Dude, I remember I flew from Los Angeles to Sydney while there was the terrorist attack in Martin Place in the CBD.
Oh, wow.
And it was a very eye, because the whole world stopped. Everyone's eyes were on Sydney, and I was just floating in a tin can, to quote Bowie, right? So, and then on the second one, I think it's tough because there's the dispensing and closing the hatch on people is always something that's seen with like malice and ill content. It's like, no, man, like it's a parting of ways. For me, the way I would calibrate, and the way I've calibrated in the past, is like, if I have continual or recurring memories of a person that I've closed the hatch on, it just tells me that there's a lesson there that I haven't learned yet. Right. And then once I've learned the lesson, and like, I know I've served this to other people, and this is kind of we just sort of collide into each other, like some sort of this little molecules, and however deep into philosophy or physics you want to go. But it's just like, because I've closed, and I don't want, like, again, not, I'm like, oh, fuck you, I'm going to block and unfollow you. I think that's another dissonance that I see a lot. I've never blocked or like tried to ban or report anyone on social media, because I cannot do that in real life. I know I cannot, at a certain point, I could show up somewhere and see this person. So I cannot create an outer valence of this thinly veiled security online, because I cannot replicate that in real life. Again, the fracturing of like your human avatar and your digital avatar, I see as something that's really detrimental to people now, because it gives them this false sense of security of like, oh, this person is blocked, they don't exist. It's like, you know how you block someone in real life? you have to go fucking murder them. That's how you block them in real life. So unless you're willing to get your hands dirty, don't hit that block button because you've created a dissonance between those two things. But yeah, I don't think so for me, like I've had to, and not had to, I've chosen to, and not out of malice. I think that's one of the big takeaways. It's like you can, with no ill content towards someone else, close the hatch, and it doesn't have to be slamming the door, right? It can be quite just a riding off into the sunset and never the twain shall meet sort of thing. So I think that is helps again overcome the objection of maybe the more conscientious, emotional driven people when they hear that. Like, and on the flip side of it, like I will keep inventory of the kind of memories. If I have a recurring memory of a person that the hatch has been closed on, it's like, well, clearly that hatch isn't closed, right? That's like I still smell something. Like there's a fire not put out. So then it's just a matter of like having an honest conversation with yourself and be like, what is it that's still drawing me back to this, and putting that fire out, and then either opening the door up to realize that okay, hey, the hatch need not be closed in the first place, or putting the final fire out and being like, all right, then you can move on with your life. So I think that's again finding a middle ground between like the old school militant kind of fuck you, you're dead to me thing, and maybe a little bit more of like a liberal left leaning understanding of, okay, there's something to be learned here. um, you know so that's how I manage those thought processes, somewhere kind of right down the middle.
Yeah. Again, it's powerful insight, because I think we can come across as like I'm much in the same camp. Like if it needs to be shut down, it needs to be shut down. Like, however, sometimes that's viewed right with that negative, and there's malice behind it. And my constant retort to that always is no. I'm doing what's right for me, and remember that if there's a negative reaction to that from the other party, that's not my reaction, that's theirs. I'm not responsible for that. Like, I'm not saying you're a bad person, just saying that right now that energy is not what I need. It needs to go for whatever reason. You go do your thing, and there'll be plenty of people out there in the world, and that. So understanding that, I think people need to understand that, because I didn't understand that for a very long time, and I'm also not the best with confrontation, so maybe that's also my approach a little bit. However, sometimes I just need to step away, and I don't owe anyone an explanation behind that. I might choose to if it's a good use of my energy. However, maybe move aside. And as you said, sometimes you'll go back to those things, and that brings me to another thought I had. There's a quote out there, very popular, everyone hears it: everything happens for a reason. I disagree with that. Don't believe it's true, because if I believe that everything good happens for a reason, I must believe that everything bad happens, which I'm not okay with. If it's kids getting murdered and shit like that, can't do it. And this is a conversation I had with Carl, who's the host of, also a host of our podcast channel. So we kind of fell in the middle there, and we came up with another quote that kind of aligns in that, which is timing's everything. And to your point, sometimes I need to close the hatch because timing's not right. And maybe that person just comes back in your life. And I actually had an interaction on social media with a kind of colleague, someone I did some work with and kind of collaborated with a few years ago. And he just sent me a message back to something I commented on. It's like, I feel like we're being drawn back together again. And I didn't push him out of my circle. This happened because my energy was somewhere else. And now suddenly I feel like we're reconnected. And maybe there's something in our paths will cross in something in the future, in the near future. So I think timing is everything. I think people need to remember that. And sometimes I'm going to step away, and it doesn't mean it's malice, like you said. It's just I'm going to step away, and the timing's not right for me right now. And I think that's super important for people to kind of take that on and digest it.
Yeah, and too, like for me, I always have to be aware of people's perceptions of me. Like, you're in shape, you got tattoos, you're doing well for yourself, and it's like sometimes people can people will assign your intent to you. And it's like, I know how I look. Like when I walk into a room, like I decided, like, yeah, sure, put the tattoos on my hands. I've got the whole, I look like Ned Kelly to any Australian listeners. I look like a fucking axe murderer, right? So it's like I can attempt to approach that closing of the hatch as gently as possible, but as gently as a 270-pound tattooed guy with a big beard can look. So a lot of times it's just, if you have your own self-awareness and don't let other people infiltrate your intent and decide your intent for you, I feel like that's because, again, like that's a them problem, not a you problem. But if you don't have that awareness, then all of it, that's a you problem, right? Like I know that I can't fly. I go to a coffee shop every morning. Dude came in, he got all upset. Do that. It's a different experience when like the mid 50s guy wearing like a size small pea coat starts going off about his whatever chai tea latte than when I come in wearing a denim jacket and I were to fly off the handle. Like you need to be aware of yourself. Like that's your responsibility. Like when I've told this story a few times, like when I walk late at night and I just happen to be behind a woman headed the same direction and she looks over her shoulder and sees this, that's a me problem, because I have to understand what her base level of interpretation would be. So I pick up my phone, I call my mom, just anything to like kind of diffuse that. So I think in situations where you're dissociating, closing the hatch as it were, you need to understand that person's perception of you in the act of doing that. And there's a point where it's like you cannot sugarcoat it or make it more of a peaceful separation as you could. Like there's nothing else you could do. And at that point, if you've taken them into consideration and there's still a dissonance in their interpretation and your intent, then that's a them problem, right? But I think there's a responsibility on you to a certain degree that you should take to make sure that facilitation has been attempted, that bridge has been attempted to be crossed as peacefully as possible. But at a certain point, you're just like, okay, that's your interpretation, but you don't get to decide my intent.
Yeah. And you know what, that so interesting. I've had this conversation a few times with a few other people. Let's say of a potentially what could potentially be an intimidating stature. So now I've had that problem. I'm like 5'10", 180 pounds. I can blend in pretty easily to most environments. Now I've shaved off that terrible like Movember mustache that I had. Now I'm just going to walk in and I don't look like a perv anymore. So I'm just going to ignore me because I'm kind of me, right? I'm going to be dressed pretty normally as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to be able to kind of blend in. So maybe for me, that's a great insight that I can take on board because I've never really had to navigate that. However, I have this conversation. So both our other podcast hosts are rather large frame men, and they touch on this sometimes as well. And it just kind of made me think about it, but maybe didn't articulate quite the same way you did. And I think that awareness and we spoke about this at the weekend when we were recording a show with how does the world perceive me? And I think it links to that because you could be perceived as, and we have the beauty of social media where maybe that's not such much of a thing anymore, but you could be perceived as very intimidating to people. So being aware of that is so important. And maybe there are parts of maybe my own personality that are intimidating to people. And I should probably be more aware of that just because visually it isn't there. My point to social media was maybe people don't have that feeling towards you because they followed you, they've seen your stories, they've been on a course or they've watched something online with you. So maybe they're already not getting that intimidating, because although you might look intimidating on your frame, you as I mentioned earlier, you're totally not. Like you're totally walls down, super, engaging, and you are, just happy to stop and have a conversation. And that, I think, again, we do have to be aware, but people have to step into an environment saying, hey, you know what? Maybe they're not like that. And maybe approaching life like that, right?
Well, I think it starts with like your own level of awareness. Like,
Yeah.
To be able to see that in other people, you have to see it in yourself first. Like
Yeah.
I can make myself very small for someone my size. Like if I'm opening the door for like an elderly lady, I can be smaller than her. My voice can be softer. I can be like as small as I physically can, because it's like I know what, and maybe I'm just projecting it. Maybe she's like the toughest old lady on the planet. She'd kick my ass. I don't know, but I see it as like, okay, if I were in that situation and attempting to be empathetic, but I can also be the biggest fucking guy in the room. In rooms where I'm not physically the biggest guy, right? Like if I'm, in some sort of boardroom setting, meeting kind of thing, and I need to be a big presence, I can do that. But it's the discernment to know when to do which.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes back to the whole ecosystem thing and how we show up. So we can be the best version of ourselves. However, we have to be kind of malleable in that for exactly that, because knowing your environment, right? And knowing that some people can't see past that first impression. And maybe you need to navigate that to be able to get to the endpoint that you want. And I think that's an important message, because I think some people say, well, just be you, and regardless of what anyone thinks, but you can't do that. You're
No.
not, well, you can, but you might be, it's going to suck probably for you. It's going to be a bad time.
Yeah, I think people feel like liberated, and that liberation stifles them. Like, oh, like I don't necessarily care for people who are unfiltered. Like I admire it can be entertaining, and to a certain degree, like the way we process thoughts is filtered by our experience, and the way we act is shaped by the way we've acted in the past, and our interpretations superimposing from present to past. But I think to a certain degree, like a filtration process is I don't I don't want to say necessary, but it's so useful, because that interpretation process of not just, because people are like, oh, I just like let my emotions flow through me. It's like, those emotions flow right into other people, right? Like you want to be careful of what it is you feel great as you just unload all your garbage onto other people, but everyone that leaves you is takes that on. So it's like, I would much rather take personal sovereignty over whatever the crap I have to deal with, before I just like, yeah, it's just who I am, man. Like I'm just unfiltered. It's like, no, you're just kind of not considerate and conscientious of other people around you. Like that's what I hear and see. And hey, to each their own, that's fine. And if their superlative value is the expression of themselves and not those around them, that's totally cool. You won't be around me for very long, but I think it's such a virtue to be able to like filter that, because it shows like a level of compassion to people you're around. And I think, for me, like I without going all the way to say like what my interpretation of the meaning of life is, but I think service to others is probably one of the more profound things that you can set your sort of North Star and your morality and your actions to. And I think that is one of the things that if you can do that, even in the small interaction of opening the door for the little old lady, like that act of service is something that, whether it's, helping someone move on the weekend or something as menial as or seemingly as menial as that, I think that's actually really profound. And part of that service is sort of these more finite details of like your own awareness and other people's interpretation of where you're at. So it's like, I don't want to like chase down some old lady and like race her to the door and be like, here you go. Like I don't need to subvert her expectations. I would do her a service if I am just mindful of her existence and her interpretation of me. So I find that even that being a very small act of service, I think that's what kind of brings meaning to what we do.
Yeah, you know what? Again, something else that recorded a few weeks back, or maybe a few months back, and it was about that kind of thing. And it wasn't really pegged as the meaning of life, because it was a little deep for a short episode that I recorded. But the kind of two main things, in my opinion, that we're constantly doing in life is we're either growing or we're serving. So I think it links to that, right? Like you're finding those ways, and it could be tiny little things like opening the door. It could be on a grander scale, right? Like educating thousands of people on courses or whatever it is. It's a service. And the point that I was going to make is that that's so important, that we look to serve, and then we also look for times to grow, right? Because we have to grow to be able to serve better. So what does that look like? And sometimes it's awareness and filtering, and that's sometimes our growth procedure that leads to better serving down the line. So I think that's such a great tool. It's not that we change the version of who we are, but we filter that version for the best end result. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's one hand washes the other, right? Like, I don't necessarily love like the term reflection, because I feel like it's something that's dedicated in a lot of people's notebooks. It's something that should be a reciprocal process. It's large in part in how our brain actually works. Like our brain like maps the world and then allows us to act. It doesn't act and then map the world. Like our cerebellum actually is going to indicate how it is we move, and our cerebellum is like large in part in our central processing what enables to sort of map ourselves in space. So I hate this idea that Sunday nights are for reflection. No, it is. And just in the same way our body works and our cerebellum doesn't go, all right, we're going to recalibrate on Sunday night. It's like you missed a free throw on Tuesday afternoon. You're not going to sit there and go like, free throw went to the right on Tuesday. It's now Sunday. It's like, no, it has to be a continual process. It has to be a constant process, right? So I think, that the idea that you're either growing or you're serving, I think these two things can happen like simultaneously or contemporaneously, where it's like the more you serve, the more data points you have in which to immediately reflect on and grow. And the more you grow, the better you can serve.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. That's a super interesting take on those two things, and I love that we can maybe all take away that those two things are working together, but it takes a heightened awareness to be able to do those things at the same time. So I like that. It's
Right.
a good evolution of my thought process on that. So yeah, that's awesome. So I got one more thing. One more thing I wanted to I wrote it down. I have to ask it because I feel like it just aligns really well. So I talk a lot about, and in many shows I talk about the fitness industry and kind of my last 20 years of my life and everything I've kind of done. And people often ask me questions about, what's new in the fitness industry, what's new in nutrition and that. And really, there's not a lot. Like I always say, it's still 3 macronutrients, blah, blah, blah. Like it doesn't change a lot. And it might always, whenever someone asks my opinion on something, I'm like, remember, the fitness industry is 10% fact and 90% opinion. And that's just a rough stat I made up, but there's a few facts that support the world of fitness and movement, and then a lot of it's opinion and the way we do it, and everyone has a different path towards possible end goal as a coach or as a consumer of fitness. What I was thinking about, having listened to quite a few of the podcast episodes and watched a lot of your stuff online, is I feel like this also applies to life. That there's like 10% fact and there's 90% opinion, and what I mean by that is, stay within the law. Don't do anything where you're going to get arrested. Have some good moral stature. That's like the 10%. And I feel like everyone's looking for more than that. And rather than taking their 90% of, I might be butchering this, but taking that 90% of the rest of the world, your life, and living it how you want to live it, not how someone else lives it, and not following exactly what somebody else does and taking your interpretation. And it's like the fitness industry, because we get people that just jump on any nutrition protocol. Is a big one everyone talks about in the industry, is, we got to do this one because and I'm like, it's just somebody's opinion. It's worked for them, so it's their opinion. It doesn't mean it's any better than any other one. So how do you kind of, and I've heard you talk about this, and I'm just wondering your kind of take on it, a couple of minutes on the living the 90% of life that isn't, let's say, outside of the law. And how do you do that with little to no influence from the world, if that makes sense?
I think it's yeah, it's about consequence, right? Like I think the biggest issue is people are not clear on their 10%,
Oh,
right?
okay.
I think people cannot circumscribe the borders of what that 10% really entails. And obviously, we know the law, but I think the awareness, the the morality and like the virtue or the spirituality or however you want to address the other part of that 10%, like the internal governing that you need to process and sort of project into the world. I think people aren't clear on that. So that ends up, being not dictating only 10% of their life, but actually, let's break 10% down into 5 and 5, where it's like, here we have the law, and the other 5% of this 10% is like, your morality, your virtues, your values, let's say, probably in a simpler term. People are not clear on where their outer borders of their values are. So we have 5% of law. We kind of understand, don't speed, don't steal shit. Great. Then it's like, okay, the only other thing you need to really figure out is be aware enough of like, what are your values? What are your lines in the sand? But people don't have that circumscribed to another 5%. They allow that to bleed into the rest of the 95%. Right. And so that they're so concerned about consequence. And like, that's something like I talk about all the time. It's like, unless you're going to jail or unless you are going to die, unless you can look yourself in the mirror at the end of the day, nothing matters. Go do shit. Go do a bunch of stuff. And it's so I think people, because they don't have that awareness to take, okay, here's the 10% of stuff that is quote unquote fact, whether empirical or metaphysical. Empirical, we got, speed limit 60, don't steal someone's kids. Great. Then we get into the metaphysical, and all of a sudden no one knows what to do, and they just teeter off, and it really pollutes the rest. It's not contained, it pollutes the rest of the way they process, and they're so afraid of consequence of breaking a law that they haven't really set for themselves. It's like, you make these rules, government, mass, whatever, all this crazy shit, yeah, they make that, but it's like, you get to make your own values, and that'll cap off that 10%, and it frees up the rest of that 90% to do with it whatever the fuck you want. So I think it would start with the awareness to come up with what you value, And then from that point, your your decision making process, or the breadth of opportunities for yourself, are so much more, because you have this very, all right, here's your North Star, here's your guiding light between, the written law and your metaphysical law. Play by this rule book, and you can play any game you want.
Yeah, mate, it's so true. I think the other thing that comes up for me, and I've heard this on a show we did recently, is just be a decent human being, and then go do some shit and keep working on being the best version of you in any area of your life. And that, I think, is just a great place to kind of wrap up the show. I'm also cognizant of time. But yeah, big takeaway. Have a think about that last statement before you go on with the rest of your day when you're listening to this. Jordan, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Great chat. So nice to kind of get the, as I'm going to quote it, my cheesy episode is the man behind the deadlift, and just finding a little bit of kind of what gets you going, what gets that kind of mind ticking, how it works. So really appreciate it. Did you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, man, this is great. I like conversations like this are what make doing all the reps and sets worth it to me. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Any likes, any shares, any reviews go a massive way to extending this conversation, getting more people to start talking. So we truly appreciate it. Please head over to our website at www.weas.ca, where you can check out all of our episodes. You can check out our merchandise and see what we're doing in the world. Other than that, be the best possible version of yourself. Keep making a difference, and I'll catch you next episode.